Hello, everyone. I'm Brandon. I am an instructor with LSAT Max. Welcome to another one of our informational LSAT presentations. So today we're going to be talking about a very important concept on the LSAT, which is argument flaws. On the LSAT, and what is very different than what you've been doing for most of your at least undergraduate career, is that you get served a lot of stuff that's not very good on the LSAT. You get served bad arguments. And it's very important to be able to tell what is going wrong with an argument as you are taking the LSAT. That's true in logical reasoning. It's also true in reading comprehension. Because that skill is so very important, and because there are common ways that arguments go wrong on the LSAT, we've taken the time to create a book, and I'm going to show it to you right now, called 33 Common LSAT Flaws. It is available on Amazon, and I will show you the Amazon page in just a second. But we wrote this book because this skill, finding ways that arguments commonly go wrong on the LSAT, is critical to answering questions correctly. It's also critical to analyzing arguments under time pressure. Because if you get good at seeing these things that happen over and over and over again, you can do the analysis that the makers of the LSAT require without putting too much thought into it. So we're going to go through, in today's presentation, we're going to go through and talk about 8 of those 33 common flaws. Let me just point out, and let me share my screen with you here so I can show you. The Amazon page where you can get this book. All right, so hopefully you can all see what I'm looking at here. This is the Amazon page. We're going to throw, and Claire, our wonderful director of marketing, has already beat me to the punch. The link that I am looking at right now is in the chat box, so you can click on it and take a look. So that is where the book is available. We already have a 5-star review, even though this book just came out. We're also doing a giveaway. So by the end of today, we're going to give away 10 of these books for free. You can check out our Facebook page, our Instagram page, or our Twitter page for instructions on how to participate in that. This book, I think, is really valuable, and we put a lot of hard work into it, and I think it's really great. And so hopefully you guys will take a look, and 10 of you will walk away knowing more about the LSAT without spending even a penny on one of these books. So the way that this presentation is going to go, let me just get a few housekeeping things out of the way before we get started. I'm going to ask for some participation as we go through. There are a couple of different ways to participate. There's a chat box, and you can type your comments and questions into the chat box. The chat box tends to go by pretty fast when right now there's over 200 people watching this. So I might not get everything that goes through the chat box. You can also raise your hand in the participants box, and I can call on you, and when that happens, you can unmute yourself and you can talk to everybody just like I'm talking to everybody. There's also a Q&A box. Once we're done with the presentation, I'm happy to take your questions. So if you have questions, and that's not just on flaws, it can be about law school or other pieces of the LSAT, I'm happy to spend about a half an hour after this presentation is over answering as many questions as I can for you. Not only did I take the LSAT and get a 175, I went to law school, I practiced law for a few years. So I do have thoughts on many things if you would like to ask me about those thoughts. So having said all of that, let's get started. Let's go back up to the top. So this is the Common LSAT Flaws webinar. Well, first, let's just talk about arguments, because again, and for most people, if you were not a philosophy major as an undergrad, you didn't necessarily learn the principles of argumentation. You read arguments by people. If you're reading a scholarly work, criticism, those are arguments. But you're reading the content rather than reading for argument structure. So really an argument consists of 2 parts. Sometimes it gets a little more complicated than this, but every argument has 2 parts at the very least. The most important part of an argument is the argument's main conclusion. It's the thing that the author of the argument is trying to convince you of. To make an argument, you always have to have some support for your conclusion. You don't just tell people to believe what you want them to believe. Instead, you try to convince them. And when you try to convince somebody of something, when you make an argument, you give them premises. You give them evidence that is supposed to support the conclusion. And so that's how an argument works. I've got this thing I'm trying to prove to you, and I'm going to give you some bit of evidence that will help you come to my conclusion, that will help you agree with me. Like I was saying on the LSAT, unlike what you've probably been doing for most of your undergraduate career, the makers of the LSAT are not serving arguments to convince you. Instead, they're serving arguments, if you're looking at them the right way, to be critical of. But if you're not looking at them the right way, they're serving you arguments to trick you. They're serving you really garbage. And they want you to understand why you are reading, why what you are reading is not convincing. And to do that, you have to be critical of an argument. But there really is a certain way that you have to think in order to be critical of an argument, in order to do what the makers of the LSAT are asking you to do. And so what we are trying to do, and the makers of the LSAT, especially with error and reasoning questions, but there are other question types with flawed arguments, they're asking you what's wrong with the argument, but what they're really asking you is, why don't the premises actually support the conclusion? Let me say that again. They're asking you, why don't the premises actually support the conclusion? And the thought process that you engage in, no matter what kind of flaw you're dealing with on a particular argument, in order to be critical of an argument, is this. You accept the premises as true, and then you think, sometimes creatively, about why the conclusion might still be false nonetheless. Accept the premises as true, think critically about how the conclusion might still be false. If you are engaged in that process, not just in error and reasoning questions, but in these other questions that I'll talk about in a second, you're doing the analysis that the makers of the LSAT care about. What's nice is that the vast majority of arguments that are flawed follow common patterns. And if you memorize those patterns, and if you're looking for them, like the 33 common flaws in our 33 Common LSAT Flaws book, then you will be able to see how arguments go wrong without thinking, without like reinventing the wheel every time you're trying to figure out what's going wrong with the argument. The vast majority of flawed arguments on the LSAT are flawed in the same way. The makers of the LSAT are great at changing subject matter. They'll give you the same flaw in an argument about, I don't know, the composition of seashells, the chemical composition of seashells, that they will give you in an argument about a 19th century British author. And even though the subject matter is radically different, the argument is falling apart in the same way. And so if you can see that, you can see past the subject matter to the very good reason why the premises don't support the conclusion, then you've done the analysis that the makers of the LSAT care about. Identifying a common flaw is a shortcut to being critical of an argument. It is important, and I think it's the first step to answering each of these question types. And if you put all of these questions together, these question types here, it's most of the logical reasoning questions on the LSAT. Most questions on the LSAT have an argument in them, and most questions with an argument have a flawed argument in them. And so it's your job to figure out what's wrong with it. So the most common type of question on the LSAT is error and reasoning questions. They'll ask you things like, which one of the following errors does the argument commit? Or the argument is most vulnerable to which one of the following criticisms? All of those are just asking you what is wrong with the argument. Flawed parallel reasoning questions are doing the same thing. You find the flaw in the argument and you find the answer choice that's committing the same flaw. Strengthen, weaken, strengthen with a sufficient premise, strengthen with a necessary premise. All of these questions are asking you to do something to the argument. To strengthen an argument, you have to find out what's wrong with it first. You can't strengthen an argument without knowing where its weakness is. And so it's a necessary first step in questions that are asking you to strengthen an argument, regardless of how they're asking you to do it, to figure out what is wrong with the argument. Weaken questions. You can't weaken an argument unless you know what its vulnerability is. And that includes identifying the flaw. All of these questions, if you identify the prevalent flaw before you look at the answer choices, then you can very often, and this is when I talk about making your speeding up on the LSAT, which is very important. The time limit on the LSAT is very difficult. This is what I'm talking about. If I identify a particular flaw in the stimulus, Even if I'm doing a strengthened question, well, I know the strengthened answer is going to address that flaw. It's going to help fix it. It might not fix it all the way, but it's going to help fix it. And so it can make it so that even if I'm not anticipating perfectly what my answer choice looks like, I know what it's going to be talking about. And it makes it so that I can skip through answers that just aren't talking about the thing I'm looking for. Rather than wandering through 5 answers, comparing them to the argument in the stimulus, wandering through the answers again, that's a recipe for disaster. Argument evaluation questions as well. Those always have a flawed argument. And when you're being asked which one of the following will best help evaluate the argument, it's the one that's going to address the flaw. And so if you know what the flaw is, you can find the answer choice that is going to address the flaw as well. So that's the basic idea. To be critical of an argument is to be able to explain how the premises don't actually support the conclusion. So what we're going to do with the rest of today's presentation is we're going to work through some examples. And the way this is going to work is that I have an example that we came up with on the left. It commits a prevalent flaw, and I'm going to ask you guys for help. So I'm going to read out the argument, and then you tell me what is the flaw, by which I mean you explain to me, why don't the premises actually support the conclusion? In other words, how could it be that the premises are true and yet the conclusion is still false? If you can answer that question, you will have identified the flaw. Then we'll name the flaw, and then we will do a real LSAT question that commits this flaw, and we'll see how the makers of the LSAT address it. One last thing I want to say is that identifying these common flaws is good for finding the right answer. It's also good for knocking out wrong answers. In these flaw questions, very often wrong answers will be describing a flaw that didn't happen in the stimulus, but it will be one of the common flaws. And so if you know those common flaws and you know that flaw didn't happen in the stimulus, you can very quickly get rid of a wrong answer choice. So without further ado, let's go through this first argument. My first argument is this: 100,000 people died in car accidents last year, while only 3 died juggling chainsaws. Therefore, we must conclude that driving a car is far more dangerous than chainsaw juggling. You would agree, right? These numbers, 100,000, is many, many, many times the 3 people who died juggling chainsaws. So is it not just the case that juggling chainsaws is actually safer than driving a car? So you guys tell me, what is wrong with this argument? Why might the premises be true and yet the conclusion is false? In other words, no, this is not true, that driving a car is far more dangerous than juggling a chainsaw. So let's see, I have, hopefully Sydney has hand raised for this. Sydney, I'm gonna let you talk. You can unmute yourself. Do you wanna tell me what is wrong with this argument?
Yes, from looking at it, I think that far more people drive than in comparison to people juggling a chainsaw. So the number is off, I would assume. Yeah.
So we have some numbers here, as Sydney is pointing out, and those numbers are this. Thank you, Sydney. 100,000 is a lot bigger than 3. But the absolute number is not what's important here. Instead, what is important is the percentage of people who actually get harmed doing this thing. And so when you're talking about, and this is what's hard with the LSAT, when it says far more dangerous, well, there actually is a veiled concept here. And the veiled concept is this: the dangerousness of a particular event or a particular activity has to do with your percentage chance of getting hurt and dying. And so let's assume that the numbers are like this. Okay, 100,000 people died in car accidents. However, let's say that 100,000 was out of, I don't know, 1 million car trips. If that's the case, then your percentage chance dying, and I know we all are going to law school because we hate math, but there are some mathy concepts on the LSAT. That gives you a 10% chance of dying. That may be a high percentage chance of dying, but let's say out of these chainsaw incidents, that 3 people juggled chainsaws last year, and all 3 of them died. If that's the case, you actually have a 100% chance of dying. And so what this argument is doing is it's confusing information about absolute amounts, 100,000 people versus 3. It's confusing that with a conclusion about percent. Because when you're talking about how dangerous something is, you're talking about your percentage chance of getting hurt or dying. And so even though the amount of people who get hurt or die driving is higher than the amount of people who get hurt or die juggling chainsaws, the percentages are the opposite. The percentage of people who die juggling chainsaws is higher. So this is a percent versus amount flaw. This is fairly common on the LSAT. You'll get information about an amount or a percent in the premises, and then you'll get a conclusion about the other one. We have these categorized as versus flaws. The makers of the LSAT are very good at giving you premises about one concept that is related but is different than another concept, and they very commonly shift between them. And you can't do that. You can't shift from percent to amount. You can't shift from amount to percent. That's the flaw. Elisa is asking, does far more refer to percent? Well, when I say far more dangerous, yes, refers to percent, because dangerous is the operative word there, a higher percentage chance of dying. So now let's look at an argument that's committing this flaw. And this argument is actually a really crazy argument, but it's going to take a little bit of thinking to figure out what is so incredibly crazy about it. So this argument, so this is a flaw question, an error in reasoning question. And it says, over the past 20 years, skiing has become a relatively safe sport due to improvements in ski equipment. There has been a 50% drop in the number of ski injuries over the last 20 years. Clearly, however, there have not been decreases in the number of injuries in all categories, as statistical data readily show. For although broken legs and ankle injuries have decreased by an astounding 90%, knee injuries now represent 16% of all ski injuries, up significantly from the 11% of 20 years ago. The first and one of the most difficult parts of answering a question like this is just figuring out what are the pieces of the argument, because there's actually just a few things in here that are the argument, and then there's a bunch of other stuff. The conclusion is the thing that comes after however. And I think you can figure this out in a couple of ways. First of all, it's disputation. And that's a very common conclusion type, where you're saying something is wrong, something didn't happen. It's also the case that we have a premise word that comes after that conclusion. For, because, since, very often introduces a premise. But there's actually some stuff beginning this premise that is not part of the argument. Very often the makers of the LSAT will use words like although or while. And what they're doing is they're giving you filler. They're saying, here's something that doesn't support my conclusion. What is supposed to support the conclusion is the stuff that isn't the although. This guy's saying, yeah, sure, broken legs and ankle injuries have decreased by an astounding 90%. Here's what is supposed to be the support for this. Knee injuries now represent 16% of all ski injuries, up significantly from the 11% of 20 years ago. They do give us, although they don't use it to support the conclusion, they do give us some information that's going to be important, which is there has been a 50% drop in the number of ski injuries overall. And so let's figure out what's going on here. This guy is trying to make the conclusion that there have been at least some increases in the number of injuries, because knee injuries are 16% of injuries, up significantly from the 11% of 20 years ago. So let's take a look at the numbers. Let's say, let's say 20 years ago, what was that, 2000? Let's say there were 100 injuries overall. Actually, let's make these numbers a little easier to work with. Let's say there were 200 injuries overall. Well, if back then these knee injuries were 16% of all injuries. I'm sorry, 11% of all injuries. I know we don't want to do math, but 11% of 200. Back then there would have been 22 knee injuries. This is the absolute number of knee injuries. What this guy shows is 20 years later, the total number of injuries has dropped by half. So now we have 100. But he says, aha, look, knee injuries are up to 16%. That percentage has risen. Well, if that's the case, knee injuries are now 16% of 100 injuries overall. What is the absolute number of knee injuries that we have now? We actually have 16. And so what this shows is that even though this percentage has risen, the absolute number has actually gone down. This argument is one of those arguments on the LSAT that's so bad. If you accept all of the statements in the argument as true, the premises, the conclusion actually has to be false. Even though the percentage went up, 11% to 16%, the number of injuries actually went down. And so this guy's argument is very bad. It is a percent versus amount flaw. And we just have to find the answer choice that says that. So I'm going to give you, this is one of those magical times where I will ask you to shout out the right answer in the chat box. So take a look at these. I'm going to read the answers. And then when I look up, I'm going to hopefully see the right answer in the chat box. A says it fails to allow for there being ski injuries other than broken legs, ankle injuries, and knee injuries. B says it infers disparate effects from the same single cause. C says it ignores the possibility that the number of skiers has increased over the past 20 years. D says it assumes that an increase in the proportion of knee injuries rules out a decrease in the number of knee injuries. E says it proceeds as though there could be a greater decrease in injuries in each category on injury than there is in injuries overall. I see just an amazing amount of D in the chat box, and that is the right answer. D is the correct answer. And the makers of the LSAT use words like proportion instead of percent, but they do use words like number for amount. And so if you can see that's what's going on, I don't think you necessarily have to be able to do this math problem like I did to answer this question on test day. However, if you can see that we're moving from information about changes in percent to information about changes in amount, then you know what is wrong with the argument. It is a common flaw. It shows up over and over and over again. The makers of the LSAT are obsessed with this concept. And if you know this concept, then just scanning the words in the stimulus will help you narrow down what you're talking about. Here, they're talking about percent of injuries. Here, they're talking about number of injuries. They're telegraphing to you what is going on. So that is a percent versus amount flaw. It is a very common flaw. Let's move on to our next flaw. So again, this is an argument that is committing a common flaw on the LSAT. I'm going to read it, and then you can tell me what you think is wrong with this argument, why the premises don't actually support the conclusion. So here's my argument. You said you'd take me out to dinner, but now you're saying you don't have enough money for the all-you-can-eat diamond-encrusted lobster at Chez Rich Guy. So I guess I'll go hungry tonight, you cheap loser. So what is wrong with this argument, other than entitlement? Why does the conclusion not actually follow from the premises? So I have Brandy. I'm going to allow you to talk. Brandy, if you want to unmute yourself, you want to tell me what's wrong with this argument?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Brandy. How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good.
I think it assumes that they're going to starve if they don't have lobster, the diamond encrusted lobster.
Yeah. And so why might you not starve even if you don't get your diamond encrusted lobster?
It's pretty obvious, but I mean, there's other things you can eat besides diamond encrusted lobster.
Yeah, there's all sorts of other ways that you can find the sustenance that you need without eating diamond encrusted lobster. So thank you for that, Brandy. I think you've identified exactly what's wrong with this argument. This is a failure to eliminate alternatives. This argument proceeds as though getting rid of one option gets rid of all of the options. And process of elimination is actually very common and is an important way to make arguments on the LSAT. It's actually also very important in logic games, process of elimination. But you have to eliminate all of the alternatives if you're going to use process of elimination. And what this argument is trying to do, and is failing miserably to do, is to eliminate alternatives. Well, we've ruled out one. You know what? You don't get the diamond encrusted lobster. But you know what else is available? McDonald's, peanut butter and jelly sandwich, macaroni and cheese, whatever's in the vending machine, all sorts of stuff. So this is a failure to eliminate alternatives. It is a common flaw on the LSAT. Again, there are arguments on the LSAT that do this correctly, that eliminate alternatives correctly. But if you're not eliminating all of the alternatives, you can't do that. So let's take a look at this next question here. This question, I think, is doing the same thing. Researcher says, every year, approximately the same number of people die of, I want to say, iatrogenic disease, that is, as a direct result of medical treatments or hospitalization, as die of all other causes combined. Therefore, if medicine could find ways of presenting all iatrogenic disease, the number of deaths per year would decrease by half. So what we're saying is, look, if I can get rid of these deaths by iatrogenic disease, the disease you get from medical treatment or from hospitalization, then these deaths won't happen. But why is this a bad argument? Why can't we just infer that the people that we prevent from getting iatrogenic disease, why can't we just assume that they will all live? What are we forgetting? What we're forgetting, and Brianna is putting that into the chat box, is that you might die from something else. We are not eliminating all of the possible ways that you could die. And I think if you're reading this question and you're thinking about it, well, look, if you're getting hospitalized or treated for something, then your health might already be problematic. And so you might end up dying from the particular treatment that you get in the hospital. But if you don't die from that, you might still die from something else anyway. And so it's a little bit hard to see, but I think this answer choice is failing to eliminate alternatives. We're saying, look, if you don't die from iatrogenic disease, then you don't die. Well, iatrogenic disease is one way of dying, but we have not figured out the other ways. Daphne, I see you are very eager. I'm going to call it out right now, but yeah, you guys, I'm gonna read through the answers. You scream it out in the chat box. A says prevention of non-iatrogenic disease will have an effect on the occurrence of iatrogenic disease. B says some medical treatments can be replaced by less invasive or damaging alternatives. C, people who do not die of one cause may soon die of another cause. D, there is no one way to prevent all cases of death from iatrogenic disease. E, whenever a non-iatrogenic disease occurs, there is a risk of iatrogenic disease. So I see many, many answers. They are the right answer. C is the correct answer. And sometimes they do this. They put half of the answer in the question stem. And here we're saying failing to consider. Well, what we're failing to consider are the alternative ways of dying. So that is a failure to eliminate alternatives. C is the correct answer to this one. Some people who do not die of one cause may soon die of another. So there are some popular wrong answers. D is the correct answer. D is an incorrect answer, but I think a lot of people tend to choose this one. It says there is no one way to prevent all cases of death from iatrogenic disease. I think that's actually irrelevant to this argument that's saying, hey, look, if we could prevent all these diseases, maybe we could do it one way. Maybe we would need multiple methods. I think it's irrelevant to that hypothetical conclusion. If we could eliminate all of these iatrogenic diseases, we could save these lives. The fact that there may or may not be just one way of doing that, I think is irrelevant to the hypothetical conclusion about what would happen if we could do it. C is getting at the problem where if I'm stopping them from dying of one thing, I'm not stopping them from dying, period. I'm just stopping them from dying from that thing. So D is the popular wrong answer. That's why it is wrong. C is correct. So far, so good. That was failure to eliminate alternatives. Now let's do this next one. Why don't the premises support the conclusion? So here's my argument. The man will tell you that people are afraid to venture out during this alleged pandemic. But I conducted a survey at the beach today and everyone told me they weren't too worried at all. Therefore, the man is lying to you about how scared people are. So what's wrong with that argument? Why might it be? Look, I went out, I conducted the survey. Everybody tells me they're fine. Why might this not support a conclusion that the man is lying to you? So let's see, I'm going to let Kenneth talk. So Kenneth, if you want to unmute yourself, do you want to tell me what's wrong with this argument?
What I'm still know, the basic part of it that I don't understand, which I'm sorry for that I logged in late, I think so, is it's kind of confusing me to understand between the premises and the conclusion. I'm still struggling to get the differences.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Can you say it one more time?
I'm still struggling to understand the difference between the premises and the conclusion.
Well, the premises are supposed to support the conclusion. And so here, what I'm saying is I'm giving you reasons to agree with my conclusion. And so here, the conclusion is about whether or not this characterization of public opinion is right, whether or not people are actually afraid to go out. And so hopefully that answers your question. I'm going to, thank you, Kenneth. I'm going to call on someone else and see if they can answer my question. So I have here, I'm going to ask Daniel. Oh, Daniel is using an older version of Zoom, I'm sorry. Let me move to, here we go, Candace. Candace, you want to unmute yourself? Why do you think that these premises might not actually support the conclusion?
Because he asked the people that are on the beach if they're worried and they all answered no, doesn't mean they're necessarily not.
Well, so one, I think that's true. I do think it's the case that people don't necessarily always answer questions truthfully to a survey. And that is actually a particular flaw that does show up on the LSAT. But I think there is another reason why this survey that I did, even if people are answering truthfully, doesn't actually support the conclusion. So thank you, Candace. Let me find someone else to talk. How about Amy? Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi. Is it because it's an unrepresentative sample?
So this is yes. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, yeah. It's unfair to assume something about an entire population based on a small sample of people who just, yeah.
So this is a sample of people who happen to be out on the beach on a particular day. One, it's probably a small sample, which would be a problem. But it is also, as Amy was pointing out, it's unrepresentative. I need a sample of all people. If I'm going to make a conclusion about public opinion in general, which is what the author of this stimulus is trying to do, I need a randomized sample of people in general. Well, I'm not interviewing anybody who stayed home today. Instead, I'm only interviewing the people who made it out, the people who are at the beach. And there's a reason to believe that those people are not representative of everybody in this pandemic. There might be a lot of people who aren't at the beach simply because they're scared about being out at the beach. So this is an unrepresentative sample. And more broadly, on the LSAT, it is very common that you will get a survey and the survey will somehow be flawed. And what you always need for a survey to work is a randomized sample of the population about which you are making a conclusion. Here, my conclusion is very broad. It's about people in general, but I do not have a randomized sample of those people. So this is an unrepresentative sample flaw. Unrepresentative sample. So let's do a question and see what's wrong with this argument. So again, This is asking us what is the flaw in the argument. A recent magazine article argued that most companies that do not already own video conferencing equipment would be wasting their money if they purchased it. However, this is clearly not true. In a recent survey of businesses that have purchased such equipment, most of the respondents stated that the video conferencing equipment was well worth its cost. So our conclusion is this. This is clearly not true. It's disputation. It's a common conclusion. And then we have a survey that's supposed to support that conclusion. A survey of businesses who have purchased such equipment, most stated that video conferencing equipment was well worth its cost. So you tell me, is this survey representative of the population about which we want to make a conclusion? The people we are making a conclusion about are who? They're the people who have not bought video conferencing software yet. Who are we surveying? Are we surveying people who have not bought video conferencing software yet? No, we're actually surveying the opposite group of people. We're surveying the people who have already bought it. And so that is not a representative sample. Look, let's say I am one of the businesses in the survey, and I don't know, have an online learning company like LSAT Max. Well, video conferencing software is probably very useful for me. What if I have a tree trimming service? Is video conferencing software going to be useful for me? No. And so this is an unrepresentative sample. Don't shout it out yet. All right, we're already shouting it out. Please wait until I ask for the answer before you guys start typing the answer in the chat box so everybody can take a look at it. But let's run through the answers. Answer A says concludes that something is worth its cost merely on the grounds that many businesses have purchased it. B says takes a condition sufficient to justify purchasing costly equipment to be necessary in order for the cost of the purchase to be justified. C says rejects a position merely on the grounds that an inadequate argument has been given for it. D says relies on a sample that is reasonable to suppose is unrepresentative of the group about which it draws its conclusions. E says confuses the cost of an item with its value to the purchasers. Now you may shout it out. What is the answer? I see D, 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 D. Unrepresentative sample, and they have the language right there. Know these flaws, be looking for these flaws, the answer leaps out at you. There are actually some other answers in here that are committing other common flaws. We haven't talked about those yet. But that was an unrepresentative sample. Again, let's do an argument. You tell me why the premises don't actually support the conclusion. So here's my argument. I've lost 30 pounds since I started doing meth last week. Therefore, doing meth is a great way to get healthy. Sounds good, right? I mean, this is America after all. All that matters is if you are skinny. Isn't that how it's supposed to work? Or is it not? What is wrong with this argument? Why don't the premises actually support the conclusion? Let's see. I see a lot of hands up. So I will call on Dawn. Dawn, do you want to tell me? You can unmute yourself and let me know why these premises don't actually support my conclusion about getting healthy.
Because it's assuming that the only way to get healthy is by doing meth.
Yeah, well, it assumes that what I have done doing meth has gotten me healthy. But I think there's actually a difference going on here. And so, thank you, by the way, Dawn. What I think is happening here is that we're kind of confusing things. Losing 30 pounds, well, for some people, that might be part of getting healthy. For others, it might not. But then I'm going from that bit of what happened to my body to this much broader and actually different concept of getting healthy. And this argument is very much treating two things as the same that are very different. Those are related ideas, losing weight, getting healthy. Again, for some people, getting healthy might involve losing weight, but they are not the same thing. And in fact, losing weight is often associated with things that are very unhealthy. Things like heavy drug use, or other diseases that you might encounter where you are not healthy and yet you are losing weight anyway. And so what this argument is doing, and this I think is all over the LSAT, even on questions where they're not necessarily testing you on the flaw, the makers of the LSAT are great at this skill equivocation. And equivocation is where you just treat two things as the same or as related when they're actually not. And that's what's going on here. I'm moving from information about weight loss, fine, weight loss is one thing, to a conclusion about being healthy. But again, when we're thinking about, and this is what matters on the LSAT, what is the relationship between premise and conclusion? This premise about losing weight does not support a conclusion about being healthy. There are different concepts. And the author of this argument is just not paying attention to that. So this is equivocation. It's treating two similar concepts or two related concepts as though they're the same. So let's take a look here. And I think this argument is equivocating. And again, please don't shout out the answer until I ask for it. So we're being asked why this is vulnerable to criticism. Here's our argument. Editorialist. Society is obligated to bestow the privileges of adulthood upon its members once they are mature enough to accept the corresponding responsibilities. But science has established that physiological development is completed in most persons by age 17. Since this maturing process has been completed by most 17-year-olds, there is no reason not to grant these citizens all the privileges of adulthood. This is our conclusion. Grant them all the privileges of adulthood. And here's our premise. This maturing process has been completed by most 17-year-olds. So here we're equivocating, and again, don't shout out the answer, and you can type it into the chat box. What are the two things that are being treated the same here that are actually different in this stimulus? I see physiological development and maturity. And yeah, those are two different things. Up here, we're talking about being mature enough to accept responsibilities. Then we're talking about physiological development, and then we start talking about this maturing process. Well, being mature enough to accept responsibilities and being physically mature are two different things. They both are related concepts. You're talking about reaching whatever is the final stage of development, but it's the final stage of development in two very different things. One is being emotionally or intellectually mature. The other is being physically mature. And they are not the same thing, but the author treats them as though they are the same. So now that I have told you what is wrong with this argument, you can now shout it out in the chat box. What is our answer? Is it A, the argument assumes what it is trying to prove? Is it B, it too hastily reaches a general conclusion on the basis of a few examples? Is it C, equivocates with respect to a central concept? I see lots of C. Is it D, too readily accepts a claim by appeal to an inappropriate authority? Is it E, ignores the fact that some people are mature at age 16? It is C, it equivocates with respect to a central concept. Maturity, two different types. The author treats them as though they are the same. Equivocation, this is very, very common. Especially, and this is true with strengthened with necessary premise questions, a lot of times those arguments equivocate. And the right answer choice will just draw the concepts equivocated between together. But that is a discussion for another day. So that's equivocation. That's another common flaw. Let's talk about this next one. So why don't the premises support the conclusion here? Here's my argument. My brother stayed home from school the other day because he was sick, and mom was totally fine with it. So I ditched school today to play video games because mom made it pretty clear that she's cool with us not going to school. Well, mom flipped out. This just goes to show that mom loves my brother more than me. It's very sad. So let's accept what's going on in the stimulus. My brother, or what's going on in the premises, my brother stayed home from school. He was sick. I stayed home from school to play video games. Mom flipped out on me where she didn't flip out on my brother. Well, why doesn't that just mean that mom cares about my brother and not about me? So let me ask, here I've got Ashley. I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to unmute yourself. Why don't the premises support the conclusion? What am I missing here? Isn't it just that mom loves my brother more than me?
No. I feel that when the brother stayed home because he was sick, the mom already gave permission for him to stay home because the brother was sick. And this one, I think he just assumed that his mom's going to be okay with him staying home to play video games. They're not the same, the degree of severity are different. You know, a brother is sick, he needs to get better, and the other one is just, I just want to, you know, fool around for the day and cut class.
Yeah,
So.
Thank you. I think our author here is ignoring a relevant difference between these things. So very often on the LSAT, you will have arguments with comparisons. That's a very common way to make an argument. And here the author is comparing two things: staying home from school that his brother did, staying home from school that he did, but he's ignoring a relevant difference between the two. And the relevant difference is the purpose behind staying home. And so this argument is trying to make an argument by comparison, but it's ignoring a relevant difference. So this is specifically, and it is, you might be thinking it's related to our last flaw, equivocation, and I think it is related. I think these are very similar, where you're kind of ignoring the difference between things. But this is specifically when an argument is comparing two things and then uses that comparison in a bad way. So this is, yeah, and so Ethan is asking, is this a false comparison? Yeah, I think it's a bad comparison. There are a couple of ways you can do a bad comparison, do a false comparison. Here we are ignoring a relevant difference. And the relevant difference is the purpose behind staying home from school. So let's take a look at this argument here. Again, this is a common flaw. We'll see if this argument is committing that flaw. Elizabeth asked, could this type of flaw be on reading comprehension? Yes. I think it's very important in reading comprehension to track criticisms. And very often the author of the reading comprehension passage will be pointing out the flaws for you, which is nice of them. But yeah, this flaw and any flaw can occur in a reading comp passage. That long-term cigarette smoking can lead to health problems, including cancer and lung disease, is a scientifically well-established fact. Contrary to what many people seem to believe, however, it is not necessary to deny this fact in order to reject the view that tobacco companies should be held either morally or legally responsible for the poor health of smokers. After all, excessive consumption of candy undeniably leads to such health problems as tooth decay. But no one seriously believes that candy eaters who get cavities should be able to sue candy manufacturers. So our conclusion is this: we should reject the view that tobacco companies should be held morally or legally responsible. And we're making a comparison in this argument. We're saying, look, candy causes health problems. Nobody's suing candy manufacturers. Therefore, we shouldn't sue cigarette manufacturers. And so I think it's important. Well, Madeline is asking, by the way, hello, Madeline. I know Madeline. What are good ways to understand the difference between equivocation and ignoring a relevant difference? I don't think you necessarily need to distinguish between the two of them to get to the right answer. The point of ignoring a relevant difference is just the form of argumentation where the author is very clearly using a comparison to try to come to her conclusion. And the author is doing a bad job of using the comparison. And so it's less that there's a difference in the flaw than it's just this flaw is particular to arguments that are arguments by comparison. So that last argument that we were looking at about physical maturity was not an argument by comparison. Instead, it was just an argument where things were being confused. I think there are similar flaws, and if you identify that there's a bad comparison being made, or that the author is treating two things as the same, then you'll get to the right answer anyway. So I don't think you have to worry too much about it. It's just the form of the argument that is being used. This is an argument by comparison, and it's a bad comparison. So what is the difference? Type it into the chat box. What difference are we missing between these things? We're saying, look, you don't sue people over candy. There's health problems. So don't sue people over smoking because there's health problems there too. Why is that a bad comparison? Eunice puts it succinctly, death. Yeah. The severity of health problems that arise from smoking generally is a lot worse than things like tooth decay. And so that's what this argument is ignoring. That's the relevant difference, is the severity of the health problems. So now I'm going to go through the answer choices, and now you can shout it out in the chat box. Is the problem A, fails to establish the connection between tooth decay and candy eating is as scientifically well documented as that between smoking and the health problems suffered by smokers? Is it B, depends on the obviously false assumption that everyone who gets candy does so only as a result of eating too much candy? Is it C, leaves undefined such critical qualifying terms as excessive and long-term? D, attributes certain beliefs to many people without identifying the people who allegedly hold those beliefs? Or E, fails to address the striking differences in the nature of the threat to health posed by tooth decay on the one hand and cancer and lung disease on the other? It is E, it is ignoring that relevant difference. And E is the right answer. I hope we'll have time to get through the rest of these. We've got a few more. And we are running toward the end of our presentation. So that was ignoring a relevant difference. Let's talk about this one. It is well known that all dogs go to heaven. That makes me so sad though, because I have 300 cats. It seems my army of cats will rot in hell for eternity. Very sad. So what is wrong with this argument? We accept the premises as true. All dogs go to heaven. I have 300 cats. Well, if it's the case that all dogs go to heaven, why am I wrong in inferring that my cute little fur babies are going to hell? So let me call on, how about Anthony? You can unmute yourself. Can you tell me why my premises don't support my conclusion? All dogs go to heaven. I have 300 cats. My cats are going to hell. I'm sorry. Anthony, I think you can unmute yourself. I called on you. I think Anthony may be away. Let me ask, how about Brandy? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, you want to let me know what's wrong with my premises and the way they support my conclusion?
The premise is wrong because there's no mention of cats. There's nothing that says that cats can't go to heaven as well.
Yeah, so the premise is actually just about the wrong thing. Here we're talking about how all dogs go to heaven. Sure, that is a rule that is actually just totally irrelevant to what is going to happen to cats. And this is a conditional statement. If I say all dogs go to heaven, if you've taken the LSAT Max course, you will know that that's a diagrammable statement. If it is a dog, then it goes to heaven. What this argument is trying to do is saying, look, I have a bunch of cats. They're not dogs. Therefore, they do not go to heaven. Well, that's just not how this rule functions. And knowing that that's not how this rule functions, that the rule is about dogs and not about cats, I cannot use this rule to infer anything about cats. This is what we call incorrect reversal. What the author thinks this implies is if you are not a dog, then you do not go to heaven. But the argument just never said that. When you see, and it's always the little words on the LSAT that matter. When you see a statement like all dogs go to heaven, you're dealing with conditional logic. If it is a dog, then it goes to heaven. That does not mean if it is not a dog, then it does not go to heaven. So on the LSAT, they will be a little less obvious than this, but this is a sufficient necessary flaw. And so let's take a look at this question, and we'll see why it is a bad argument. If the magazine's circulation continues to rise as it has over the last 10 years, in another 10 years, it will be the largest selling martial arts magazine in the world. Unfortunately, it has now become clear that the magazine's publisher will not allow the managing editor to make the changes she has proposed, and without these changes, the magazine's circulation will not rise as quickly over the next 10 years as it has over the last 10. So the magazine will not be the largest selling martial arts magazine in the world. We have a conditional statement, and it looks like this. if circulation rises, then we will be the largest selling martial arts magazine. Well, what they tell us is they give us a great reason to believe that circulation is not going to rise. The magazine's publisher won't allow the managing editor to make the changes she has proposed, and these changes are necessary to get that rise in circulation. And then we're trying to conclude, well, therefore we will not be the largest selling magazine. So this is a problem. We're using that conditional statement the wrong way. Look, if circulation rises, then we'll get to be the largest selling magazine. But the fact that that condition, which is sufficient to guarantee that conclusion doesn't happen, does not mean that there's not something else that would be sufficient to make that happen. And this is what's hard about these necessary sufficient flaws, is that you can find the flaw, and then it's hard to find the answer choice. But what I would say as I'm thinking about why this argument is bad is that there's another way to be the largest selling magazine. Maybe all of the other magazines go out of business. And in that case, maybe circulation doesn't rise, and yet we are still the largest selling magazine. So that's the problem with the argument. Now we have to find the answer choice that identifies that problem. And that can be, especially with these sufficient necessary questions, that can be the difficulty. So I'll read the answers. You let me know which one is the right one. A says identify some changes required for the magazine's circulation to continue its rapid increase, and concludes from these that no other changes are needed. B equates a reduction in the rate at which the magazine's circulation is increasing with a decline in the magazine's circulation. C draws a conclusion that simply restates a claim that is presented in support of that conclusion. D takes a single fact that is incompatible with a general claim as though that is enough to show the claim to be false. E treats an occurrence that will ensure a certain outcome as something that is required. I see you guys choosing it. E is the right answer. Ensure, that's another way of saying sufficient. Required, that's another way of saying necessary. The makers of the LSAT know all of these synonyms, and they will deploy them to try to confuse you, but this is just a sufficient necessary problem. If you look at something like this, equates, that's identifying equivocation. That didn't happen here, but if you know the flaw of equivocation, which we now know, you can say, oh, I know that flaw, and that's a flaw that didn't happen here. I can just get rid of that answer choice. Answer choice D is actually identifying a flaw we're going to see if we get to the last question, which is the outlier flaw. It's not something that happened here, but that is a flaw with the argument, or is a flaw with a different argument, treating a single fact incompatible with a general claim as though it's enough to show that claim to be false. E is the right answer. It's a sufficient necessary flaw. All right, let's do one more, and then we're going to have to move on. Let's do this one. In his most recent book, Dr. Ron McRonald argued that climate change is real and caused by human activity, but not surprisingly, it turns out that much of his argument was based on flawed data supplied by people with a political agenda. So we can finally put to rest this climate change hoax once and for all. Ulissa was asking, is C a circular reasoning flaw? Up here, yes, draws a conclusion that simply restates a claim. That's a circular argument. That's identifying a circular argument. Those are almost never the actual flaw in the stimulus, but they are very commonly wrong answer choices. So what's wrong with this argument? I mean, this claim that Dr. Ron McRonald made was based on flawed data supplied by people with a political agenda. Well, if his argument for climate change is so bad, isn't climate change a hoax? Let me ask, let's see, who's got a hand up here? Let me ask, how about Kyler? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Can you hear me? You want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hey, Kyler, so why can we not just finally put this climate change to hoax? I mean, this argument was based on bad data.
Well, because, like, I mean, you kind of mentioned it earlier, but just because there is just because there's flawed data or that somebody has an agenda doesn't mean that they're necessarily wrong. Like, you'd have to, like, the conclusion can still be correct even though if it's presented in a flawed way or using, like you said, flawed, or like the question says, flawed data.
Fantastic. Yeah, and that's exactly what's going on here. So this is a very common way that people, thank you, Kyler, by the way, that people attack arguments on the LSAT is Dr. Ron McRonald has a conclusion, and it's climate change is real and caused by human activity. Well, the premise that he provides for that support is this data. And we've shown that that premise is a bad premise. But you know what? Attacking the premise of an argument doesn't mean that that argument's conclusion is false. Instead, it just means that you have identified something that shouldn't be used to support the conclusion. Well, it's entirely possible that some data supporting a conclusion is bad, but that conclusion is still true. And so this is an absence of evidence flaw. The mere fact that you have hurt the premise supporting your opponent's conclusion does not mean that you have negated his or her conclusion. And if you think about it, look at the conclusion. Climate change is a hoax. Where is the affirmative support for that idea? That climate change is not real. There is absolutely no support for that idea. Instead, there's just an attack on an argument making the opposite point, that climate change is real. So this is a common flaw, absence of evidence. And I think the best way to look at this is you've got to say, is there any support for the main conclusion of this argument? There is absolutely no support for the idea that climate change is a hoax. There's just an attack on a premise supporting an opposite conclusion. All right, so this is our last argument that we're going to get a chance to look at. Several companies that make herbal teas containing ginseng assert in their marketing that ginseng counteracts the effects of stress. As a result, many people buy these products hoping to improve their health, yet no definitive scientific study links ginseng with the relief of stress. Thus, these marketing campaigns are making false claims. Conclusion. This claim is false. In other words, ginseng does not counteract stress. Where is the affirmative support for that idea? That ginseng doesn't work. There is none. Instead, the author is saying, look, they're making all of these claims, but they don't have any support for their claims. Therefore, their claims are false. All this author has proven is that there might not be a great reason to believe the claim is true. That does not mean that the claim is false. It just means that no good argument has been made for it yet, or maybe the best argument has not been made for it yet. So this is an absence of evidence flaw. There is literally no evidence for the idea that the claims are false. There is only evidence that the claims are not properly supported by studies. So I'll read through, you tell me what the answer is. Is it A, rejects an argument because of its source without evaluating the argument's logical strength? Is it B, and you guys are already doing that, concludes that a claim is false merely on the grounds that it has not been shown to be true? I see so many B's, I'm not even going to keep reading. B is the correct answer. Absence of evidence. Again, this is a very common flaw in the LSAT. If you know this flaw, if you are looking for this flaw, this question becomes incredibly easy, whereas it might not be that easy before. And look, now that we know some other flaws, basis of a sample that is likely to be unrepresentative, the makers of the LSAT just throw these flaws at you. They show up over and over again, not just as the right answer, they show up as the wrong answer. And so if you know these flaws, you have them down by heart. You can just get rid of wrong answers because you know that we do not have an unrepresentative sample. And that is the wrong answer. B is the right answer because it is an absence of evidence flaw. All right, unfortunately, we're not going to get to our last question, but I would like to talk to you very briefly about LSAT Max. The packages all have payment plans. We know it's expensive to get good LSAT preparation, but you don't have to shell out all at once. What separates LSAT Max from the competition is a couple of different things. We have been doing distance learning for a long time. Studying for the LSAT by yourself can be very difficult. And I'd just like to point out a couple of different things. First of all of our packages come with instant lifetime access. That includes personalized support for as long as you're studying for the LSAT. Studying by yourself can be difficult. We want to welcome you into the family and to help you get to your goal, regardless of how long that takes. We'll give you a study plan when you first start out with LSAT Max. That study plan starts about 4 months out from your test date. Anybody who is telling you you can study for the LSAT in a week or two is not telling you the truth. But we'll give you a study calendar. You will be working through the same 100 hours of lesson videos that also come with lots of questions, real LSAT practice questions, drills, flashcards. You'll be working through the lessons at the same time as other people. There are real-time message boards appended to all of the questions. So you can ask instructors and they'll answer your questions about those questions. Students talk to each other on the message board, so there's a lot of support going on there. We have office hours, always at least weekly, oftentimes more. That's where a particular, one of our 99th percentile instructors will lead you through a particular question type or concept on the LSAT, and you can ask your questions. Our digital LSAT simulator looks just like the LSAT on test day. You don't want to learn how the mechanics of the test work before you get there. This, I think, is especially important. We're always tracking your performance with detailed analytics. That's especially important toward the end of the course. We get you through the course in about 2 months, which leaves about 2 months for practice and review, which is where people really start to see improvement. And you need to know what are your strengths and weaknesses so you can make sure that practice and review phase is efficient and effective. If you buy the bigger packages, you'll have access to all 90 prep tests, all 9,000 questions in the history of the LSAT, more questions than you can ever do. And finally, higher score guarantee. Take a diagnostic exam. If you don't score higher on the LSAT, we will give you your money back. I think that is mostly what I wanted to tell you about LSAT Max. So I hope some of you guys will sign up. I'll see you in office hours. Maybe I will see you on one-on-one tutoring. So now I am going to answer questions in the Q&A box. If you have more questions, feel free to type them in there. Some of these I think have already been answered. But Oliver asks, with all the time I have in quarantine, I've been studying for the LSAT early. Would law schools penalize an LSAT taken as early as my sophomore year? Not at all. Instead, I think what you should know is that almost every school will accept LSAT scores up to 5 years old. So as long as you are applying for law school within 5 years of taking the exam, it does not matter when you took it. And I see Emily already answered my question for me, but yes. Some of these are about questions that we already went through. So I'm going to skip those. Taylor asks, I'm taking the LSAT, the July LSAT Flex on the 12th. Are there any tips for what I should be doing to prepare for my last week before the exam? Well, that is a broad question, but I guess what I would say is that it's very important at this point to work on a couple of things. Most importantly is to work on timing, or at least for most people, most importantly is to work on timing. And there are a number of ways to do that, but I think the most important thing is, and this is true of all of the sections, you don't want to do the questions necessarily in the order the makers of the LSAT serve them to you, because they're not serving them to you in an order that helps you. This is especially true in logic games, where a lot of times if you're doing the if questions first, you'll get information in the hypotheticals you build that are helpful in answering the other questions. And so you might do the later questions beforehand. But you want to be skipping around and picking up all the points you're likely to get before you're tackling the tougher questions. On top of that, and this is where I was talking about those analytics are important, I think what you want to do is to figure out where your strengths and weaknesses are and to review the materials. That can be the lecture, videos, your notes, any practice that you've done, flashcards that you've made on your areas of weakness, and make sure that you've really got those areas down. Again, and we have done whole office hours on practice and review. I know that's a very quick answer to that question. Let's see, a couple of these are, is it possible to only purchase tutoring hours? It is possible. And I would recommend that you do that if tutoring will be helpful for you. So yes. That was already answered. Here comes the question. What did you study in undergrad and how did it help you on the LSAT? Well, I did the LSAT major. I was a philosophy major. I was a logic nerd, and I took all of the symbolic logic classes that were offered. And that is the only major that prepares you for the LSAT. Everything else is totally irrelevant for the LSAT. That does not mean you should major in philosophy just to take the LSAT, because philosophy becomes incredibly useless once you're done taking the LSAT. But it is very, very helpful, and nothing else is helpful at all, unfortunately. Erica asks, is there a guarantee that your score will go up if we take the course? Yes, we have an increased score guarantee if you do not see, so you take a practice exam. If on your actual LSAT, your score does not go up from your practice exam score, we will give you your money back. If I started July 1st, will I be ready for an October LSAT? Yeah, that's a good time to start studying for the October LSAT. Any later than that, and you start pushing it, but what you should expect is that studying for the LSAT is going to consume, if you're going to study fully, starting from the beginning and learning all of the concepts well and doing all of the practice, it's going to take about 180 hours minimum. That's 100 hours working your way through the course, 80 hours of practice and review. And so depending upon how quickly you can get through 180 hours of work, if you can put in 10 hours a week, that's going to take you 18 weeks. You can put in 20 hours a week, it's going to take you 9 weeks. So I think that's kind of how you can very broadly estimate how long it's going to take you. But yeah, starting July 1st, I think is a great starting point. All right, let's see. Whoops. Olivia asks, how often should you take practice tests? I've heard 1 a week, but how soon is your prep? Should you start taking timed practice tests regularly? So the way the LSAT Max course is set up is that we have, I want to say 4 exams that you take throughout the course. And then at the end of the course for that 2-month practice and review session, you should take a practice exam per week. And you're reviewing the practice exam the next day. And really what you're doing, if you're doing the review method that we recommend, is you're more or less taking the practice exam twice. Once under timed pressure and then another time not under timed pressure. And so ultimately you will end up taking a lot of practice exams. But in that earlier phase, the phase where you're just going through the course, generally you're going to take maybe 1 practice exam every few weeks. It's once you get to the review portion, about a practice exam a week. With the LSAT Flex, and I don't, now that coronavirus cases are spiking again, I think we might get more LSAT Flexes, whereas I thought we were going to go back to normal LSAT Flexes, normal LSATs. The LSAT Flex is only 3 sections as opposed to 5. It is less draining to take an LSAT Flex practice exam. And so I think you can step up that number if you're studying for the LSAT Flex, because 3 sections, you can take a 3-section exam and study more afterward. With a 5-section exam, it kind of, blows your thinking capacity for the rest of the day. How important are extracurriculars, internships for getting into law school? Well, let me explain it like this. Law school admissions is kind of a 2-step process, where in the first step, law schools will look at your GPA and your LSAT score. They call that the academic index. And they determine whether or not those are numbers that they want to report to the American Bar Association, because those numbers, the averages, their average, their medians, their median GPA, their median LSAT score is a big factor in how they get ranked, which is a big factor in how many people are willing to apply and whether or not they're willing to pay full tuition. And so if you're going to bring down both of those numbers, if you're well below their median GPA and LSAT, then those extracurriculars and internships aren't going to help you at all. They're just not going to admit you. If you are kind of right in the sweet spot and you have numbers right around their median for both, then that stuff becomes very, very important, because that's how they're determining between you and somebody else with numbers that are close. If you're well above their median GPA and well above their median LSAT, they're probably going to accept you even if your extracurriculars and internships, even if you don't have them. And so I think it's most important where you're in that kind of mid-range for a school, because that's where they're really going to be looking at all of the pieces of your application. All right, Kamir asks, I just started studying for the LSAT. When do you think is the best time to take it if I want to apply for fall 2021? Asking because I know the slots for law school close as time goes on and that I should try to apply as soon as possible. So application season for fall 2021 is going to open in October of this year. All things being equal, it's best to have your application completed by the time application season opens. However, every school keeps application season open through February. Most schools, or a lot of schools, will keep it open beyond that. So that would be February of 2021. And I think it's better to apply with a strong LSAT score later in the application period than if you have a weak LSAT score in the beginning. So ideally by October, definitely by February, because you're starting to get a little bit late. Law schools do rolling admissions. They start giving away seats at the beginning of the admissions period. But with a strong LSAT score is better than early with a weak LSAT score. Courtney asks, how many hours a week do you recommend studying for the LSAT? Hours in a month? I really think 10 hours a week minimum, because I don't think you can really nail concepts if you are doing any less than that. Probably 20 hours a week is better, I would say. But ultimately, like I was saying, you're going to spend about 180 hours studying for the LSAT. And so depending upon, you know, your particular needs, family, job, school, mental health, that changes from person to person. Samantha says, I'm an incoming sophomore in college. What do you recommend me doing since it is too early to start preparing? Well, I think you can do, you know, you can, well, number one, and this is where you're in a good position, is keep that GPA up. That is very, very, very important. Everything else that you can do now is secondary to that, although you could take the LSAT now if you wanted to. You certainly don't have to. But I think, like we were talking about, internships, things like that, you know, volunteering with student groups, law-related groups. Lots of schools have like a pre-law association. Participating in that, I think, can be helpful, not just in having it on your resume, but in getting solid information and being surrounded by people who are also going to law school. So that's what I would do. Wow, this is a tough question to answer, especially in the little time that we have, but I'll do my best to give you some tips. So Emily says, I struggle with reading comprehension, especially with timing. Do you have any tips? A couple of things. One is consider doing the section backward, by which I mean doing, usually the earlier passages are a little bit easier, the later passages are a little bit harder. A lot of times people will kind of spend their time on the easier passages, and then by the time they get to the harder passage, there's just no time left and they're drained. So I think it can be helpful to do it backwards, to start out with the harder passages, get those out of the way, and then the easier passages you can do in less time and with less, you know, mental agility left. I also, and this is again something that is kind of a longer conversation that we have here, but you have to be reading for argument structure. So it's very easy to space out while you're reading, and then you have to read the same thing over and over again, which eats into your time. But I always look at a reading comprehension passage as pieces of a puzzle to put together. We talked today about the pieces of an argument. I'm always scanning for the first conclusion. There are multiple arguments often in reading comprehension. Once I found that first conclusion, I'm reading everything else in light of it. Oh, this is a premise that supports it. Oh, here's a criticism of it. And I think if you're doing that, you can help yourself not to space out, because you're completing a task, putting together the pieces of a puzzle, rather than just reading something incredibly boring that you don't care about. Candace asks, I struggle with logic games. Any tips? Again, this is a long conversation that we don't necessarily have time to have a fulsome conversation with now, but a couple of things. One is doing scenarios. So we call them guru games, but I would say probably about half of games are such that it's useful to create scenarios. And what I mean by creating scenarios is you take one rule or one variable and you create setups for each way that it could work. Once you have done that, you have a bird's eye view of the game. anything that could work in the game will work in one of those scenarios you created. Conversely, anything that doesn't work in one of those scenarios you created is false about the game. And that can help you speed up. It can also help you make deductions that you would not make otherwise. I think that's the probably main thing that students do. The other thing that students tend to struggle with is creating setups to accurately represent what's going on in the game. And I think what you have to do to address that is to know that there are standard setups for game types, like an in and out grouping game. There's a standard setup. Well, then they'll give you some weird rule that will kind of make you tweak your setup. But if you are taking something standard and adapting it to what you're reading, that's much better than just trying to reinvent the wheel to create a setup every time you do a game. So I think having a standard library of setups to tweak when you're getting different rules, I think is helpful. If I start now, will I be okay for the November LSAT? Yes, you're starting with plenty of time. So good job. I want to prove your decision there. Is there any harm in studying at a slower rate over the course of 2 years in advance and studying gradually more as the time gets closer? The harm that I see is burnout. You know, studying for the LSAT for 2 years can be a lot. And I know you're studying at a slower rate, but you might be incredibly sick of it, and then you're ramping it up at the end. So, you know, everybody's got their own strengths and weaknesses. Maybe that would be a good plan for you, but I would just throw that out there. I would be worried about burning out on studying for the LSAT, studying at a slower rate. Let's see here. Taylor says, I've been continuing to take full-length practice exams. Do you think this is to my detriment even though I'm taking the flex? No, I think if you were doing it the other way around, it would be a problem. If you were taking 3-section exams, studying for a 5-section exam, because you wouldn't be working on endurance. But if anything, I think taking 5-section exams, or well, they're 4-section, the ones that we give you on LSAT Max because they don't release the experimental. But no, I think that's great because it will make, if anything, the LSAT Flex seem easy because it's only 3 sections. So I think that's perfectly fine. Let's see. If you have a lower GPA, is it still good to apply as early as possible? What I'm wondering is if what you mean by your question is, should I try to raise my GPA before I apply? And if you can, then yeah, I mean, applying with a higher GPA is better than applying with a lower GPA. But the problem is, by the time you get to where you're applying to law school, generally you've done 3 years of school, you have like another year maybe left, and you know, your GPA, the more classes you have taken, the harder it is to improve it. And so, you know, if you can get from like a 3.0 to a 3.5, that's a huge jump, but that's nearly impossible that late in school. So I guess maybe I don't have enough information to answer your question, but that's how I'm thinking. Would you recommend taking only the 3 sections for a practice test or all 5? It depends on which exam you are studying for. If you're studying for the LSAT Flex, then just go ahead and take the 3-section exams. But if you are anticipating, and again, I don't know when the regular LSAT is coming back, but if you're anticipating taking all 5 sections, a 5-section exam, a regular LSAT, then you definitely need to practice with that test day format. So again, it depends on which exam you're taking. Kristen asks, I'm an older student. Do they then look at my work history instead of internships activities? I'm a nurse if that helps. Yeah, so yes, and you're still going to, and you can still talk about what you did in college. I don't think that it means that you can't talk about that. But yeah, and what you're going to do is you're going to write a personal statement. And your personal statement will be the argument for why you are you know, a unique addition to the particular law school that you're applying to. And so probably since you've been a nurse, you know, you would talk about that history and what, you know, that has led you to understand and why that has led you to law school. The thing is, letters of recommendation, if you've been out of school for more than 5 years, then you can get business recommendations, which would be, you know, your supervisors or colleagues could write you letters of recommendation. If you have been out of school less than 5 years, then you're probably still going to need to get academic references. But it sounds like you've probably been out of school for more than 5 years. And so I would assume that most of your application package, you know, aside from the transcripts from your undergrad work, is going to have to do with what you've done since you've been out of college. And I think that's great. A few more. Once you get accepted into law school, what is the likelihood of getting financial scholarships? Do many people get them? Well, so the way that it works is that a law school is going to make you a financial aid offer. They will calculate your cost of attendance, and then they will tell you how you should expect to finance it. They will give you things like tuition reduction, which is another way of kind of saying a scholarship, where they're saying we're not necessarily going to charge you the entire amount of your tuition. Anything that is not covered by tuition reduction and scholarships is covered by loans, mostly federal loans. And your chances of getting that tuition reduction, whether that's through scholarships, whether it's just a straight up tuition reduction, the higher your LSAT score and GPA are, the more likely you are to get one of those, because they use that to entice students who are going to bring their numbers up. So if you're applying to a school and you are well above their median GPA and LSAT, then you can expect you're going to get a lot of tuition reduction. If you're not, then you can expect you're probably going to need to pay close to full tuition. Let's see, I already answered a question close to that. A few more. This one's easy. When applying to law school, do you need to have your LSAT score, or can you submit it later? Well, you can start creating your applications, but no school will review your application until it is complete. An LSAT score for most schools is part of a complete application, and so even though you have submitted the pieces, they won't look at it. So you do need to finish your LSAT first. Better law school out of state or not as good law school in my state if I want to practice in my state? I think you have to make your decision on law school based on a number of things. One of those things, and one of those very important things, is what is going to help you get the job in the market that you want to get in. And so if there is a school in your state that, you know, has, you know, they work with the law firms in your state, and law firms will recruit out of that particular school probably. If you want to do big law, if you're gonna want to go work for like Jones Day or Morrison and Forrester or Irell and Manella, one of those firms, then you have to go to one of the big law schools. You have to go to a top 14 law school, or else they're just not going to recruit you. But I think for most people, the prestige of law school is less important than they think it is. Think about where you want to be a lawyer, what kind of law you want to practice, and then go to the school that's going to help you achieve that goal without being massively in debt by the end of it. All right, let's do one more question, and then I'm